He poured hot coffee on her hand in front of every curtain on the street, and not one of them opened. That was his first mistake. His second was thinking silence meant she was alone. The rain came down in sheets over Cedarwood Heights the evening Naomi Carter arrived on Magnolia Grove Court, and the neighborhood looked exactly the way money always looked when it wanted to be left alone. Perfect lawns behind iron fences, porch lights glowing gold, American flags hanging still in the wet air like they belonged to a different country than the one Naomi had spent her whole life navigating. She pulled her old Chevy Malibu to the curb in front of a small brick house at the end of the row and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at the place her Aunt Elaine had spent 32 years of her life paying for, cleaning, tending, and protecting from people who never thought it should belong to her in the first place. The house was modest by Cedarwood standards, no fountain, no three-car garage, but it sat on its lot with a kind of quiet dignity that Naomi recognized immediately, because her aunt had carried that same expression her entire life. Naomi was still in her night shift uniform from the janitorial service she used as cover, the fabric dark with rain, before she even made it from the car to the front step. The paper grocery bag she carried split at the bottom as she fumbled with the key, and a can of soup rolled across the wet concrete toward the flower bed, while an apple bounced once and settled against the porch railing like it had given up. She stood there for a second, holding the ruined bag, rain sliding down her neck, key finally turning in the lock, and she thought about her aunt, about Elaine Carter in her white nurse's uniform, spine straight, smile earned, hands that had held strangers through their worst nights for 41 years. And she whispered, almost without meaning to, "I'm here, Aunt Elaine. I finally made it." She had no way of knowing yet that the man across the street had been watching this house for 3 weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. Marcus Holloway had already made his call before Naomi finished picking up the soup can. He stood at his front window in a pressed navy blazer with a silver travel mug in his hand, watching her with the patient, measuring look of a man who had done this before, who had learned exactly how much pressure it took to make certain people understand that belonging was not something you inherited. It was something you were permitted, and permission in Cedarwood Heights had always run through him. He dialed Officer Brett Dawson on the second ring. "There's an unfamiliar woman entering the Williams property," he said, his voice as calm as if he were ordering dinner. "She looks like she forced entry. I'd appreciate a welfare check." He hung up before Dawson could ask questions. Inside the brick house, Naomi had set what remained of her groceries on the kitchen counter and stood with her back against the door, breathing slowly in the dark. The house smelled of old wood, faint antiseptic, and something floral she couldn't name, something that lived in the curtains and the cushions and the walls, something that was entirely her aunt. A small framed photograph hung beside the pantry. Elaine Carter in her nursing uniform outside St. Agnes Hospital, 1991, back straight, chin up, eyes looking directly at the camera as if daring it to look away first. Naomi looked at that photograph for a long time. She had driven 7 hours, worked a full night shift before that, and had $47 in her personal account because the assignment paid through channels that didn't touch her wallet. She was hungry. The rain was getting louder on the roof. She turned on the kitchen light, found 1 egg and half an apple in the cooler she had brought, and stood at the stove. Through the window she had heard him, the wrong name, said with the casual certainty of a man who erases people before he moves against them. Williams. Not Carter. Never Carter, if he could help it. She was still standing there when the headlights swept across the front window, and the knock came, hard enough to rattle the glass, with the particular authority of someone who believed the door would open simply because they had touched it. Officer Brett Dawson stood on the porch with one hand resting on his belt and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and behind him, stepping down from a black Mercedes like a man arriving at something he had already decided the outcome of, was Marcus Holloway with a paper cup of coffee steaming in the cold air. Naomi opened the door halfway and said, "I live here," and Dawson looked at her night shift uniform, her wet hair, the kitchen light still on behind her, and said, "Your house?" The way a man says something when he already knows the answer he wants to hear and is simply waiting to hear it confirmed. She told them about her aunt. She told them about the deed. She retrieved the temporary transfer papers with both hands and held them out carefully. And Dawson took them and barely glanced at the first page before crushing them slowly in his fist, twisting them into a hard white ball while Naomi watched with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that any movement can be described as threatening. "These look printed at a library," he said. "They're legal documents," she said. "Legal," he repeated. with a smile that turned the word into an insult, and then he threw the crumpled papers directly at her face. The hardened edge caught her cheekbone with a sharp, clean snap, and when her hand came up reflexively, her fingertips found blood. Not much, but enough. Marcus watched this happen. He set his coffee down on the porch railing and looked at her the way a man looks at minor weather. Then, as she bent to retrieve the ruined papers, he shifted his shoe toward a standing puddle near the step and flicked it, deliberately, almost elegantly, sending a sheet of muddy water across her jacket, her face, and the open cut on her cheek. The mud reached her eye. She gasped. Dawson said, "Hands where I can see them." And Naomi straightened slowly, half bent, blood and mud on her face, both hands visible, in front of every closed curtain on Magnolia Grove Court. The laughter followed Naomi inside. She heard it through the door, Dawson's laugh, loose and satisfied, the kind that had never been challenged, and she stood with her back against the wood until it faded into the rain. Then she gave herself 10 seconds. She had learned this somewhere between Quantico and the first really bad assignment. 10 seconds to shake. 10 seconds to feel it. 10 seconds to let the humiliation be real before she put it somewhere useful. She counted them silently, eyes closed, burned hand pressed against her ribs. When she opened her eyes, her face had changed. Not calmer, exactly. Sharper. The Bureau had arranged access through the estate attorney 3 days before Naomi arrived, and she had confirmed the drop point, over a secure line from the road. She pulled up the floor plan Hayes had sent her 3 weeks ago, memorized, not printed, and found the hall closet on the first try. She crossed the kitchen, moved the mop bucket, pressed 2 fingers against a knot in the baseboard, and lifted a false panel. Inside, a hardened laptop, a medical kit, and a compact surveillance unit. She cleaned the cut on her cheek at the sink, held her burned hand under cold water until the worst of the heat subsided, and then she sat at the kitchen table and opened the laptop. Thumbprint, retinal scan, passphrase. The screen lit up with federal access clearance, and she tagged the night's audio file. Every word, every sound, the impact of the paper on her face, the gasp when the coffee hit, all of it, with her good hand moving slowly. The burned one resting wrapped in a dish towel against her side. Initial contact. Marcus Holloway initiated police response. Officer Brett Dawson. Racial intimidation. Destruction of temporary ownership documents. Physical assault. Burn injury. Witnesses present. Then she opened the secure call to Leonard Hayes, and when his face filled the screen, broad-shouldered, tired, gray-bearded with the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent decades watching good evidence disappear into bad systems, he looked at her cheek first, then her hand, and said simply, "Tell me." And she told him everything, voice level, eyes dry, because the 10 seconds were over and the work had begun. What she had not yet told him was the letter she had found in the kitchen drawer, Annalane's handwriting, dated 3 weeks before she died, directing her to the old freezer in the storage unit off Route 22. She would get to that. First, she needed to document the fact that Marcus Holloway had felt comfortable enough to burn her hand in front of half the neighborhood. The morning after brought an HOA notice taped to the door, and Marcus Holloway on the porch before her coffee finished brewing, flanked by a thin woman in a cream cardigan, Patricia Elwell, compliance secretary. Clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, and a heavy-set man in a golf jacket with the Cedarwood Heights crest stitched over his heart, who introduced himself as George Talbot, chair of property standards, and looked past Naomi into the hallway with the casual intrusion of someone who had never been told his gaze had limits. Marcus wore a light gray suit and the expression of a man performing disappointment for an audience. He spoke about community standards, about documentation, about the kind of ownership that required more than a key and a sad family story. He looked at the photograph of Elaine Carter on the kitchen wall and said, "Your aunt was a respectable woman." And Naomi felt the trap close around the sentence before he finished it. So she was already watching his eyes when he added, "But respectability is not automatically inherited." The silence that followed was brief but complete. Then Patricia, while Marcus was adjusting his cuff, leaned slightly forward and pressed a folded slip of paper into Naomi's unburned hand with a motion so small it looked like nothing. Naomi closed her fingers around it without looking down. When they left, she unfolded it over the kitchen sink with her back to the window. The handwriting was careful, tight with anxiety. "I have files. 8 years of records, I'm afraid. Please don't use my name yet." Naomi looked at it for a long moment, then looked toward the back door where, an hour later, Earl Washington appeared holding a paper bag from the diner on Route 22, wearing a Navy veteran's cap and the measured calm of a man who had decided the night before to stop being quiet. "Biscuits," he said. "My wife used to say a woman under siege ought to eat like a farmer. and behind him Dorothy Mills, retired court clerk, with a key taped inside a church program and 30 years of knowing exactly what had been buried in this neighborhood. Walked through the back gate, carrying a casserole dish and the look of someone who had been waiting a long time for the right person to arrive. The invitation arrived by hand, no stamp, cream envelope, Marcus Holloway's name embossed in gold, and Naomi understood immediately what it was. Not an olive branch, not a courtesy, but a stage. The Ridgemont Golf and Dining Club sat behind a stone gate, and old oak trees trimmed with the kind of precision that announced money had been here long enough to stop announcing itself. The valet glanced at her Chevy Malibu with the professionally neutral expression of someone trained to manage discomfort, and Naomi handed him the invitation without explanation. Inside, the room smelled of lemon polish and roasted chicken, and the specific confidence of people who had never once been made to feel that they had arrived somewhere uninvited. Marcus saw her the moment she entered, and his face tightened for exactly 1 second before the smile returned, wider than before, which told her everything. He introduced her to the room as a property holder still working through the verification process, and the polite laughter that followed was small but surgical. Naomi sat at the table his assistant had assigned her, near the kitchen door, with a clear view of the room and the side hallway where men went to speak freely, and she kept the recorder button active in the fold of her collar. When Marcus presented the access road project and pointed to the map, the narrow strip behind her aunt's lot sitting directly across the proposed development corridor, a woman at a nearby table asked what happened if a property holder refused to cooperate. And Marcus smiled the smile of a man who had never had to answer that question honestly and said, "Then we rely on lawful pressure." And Dawson, standing against the side wall in plain clothes, added under his breath, "or other kinds." Then Agnes, the woman Hayes had mentioned, older, black service uniform, eyes that had learned not to look directly at the men she served, paused beside Naomi's chair, poured coffee she hadn't asked for, and pressed a small USB drive into her bandaged palm with the quiet certainty of someone who had made the decision before she left the house that morning. The envelope was taped to her door at first light, no return address, printed in plain font, "Last chance. Sell before you lose more than papers." She photographed it, sealed it, and had it logged in the federal case file before the coffee finished brewing. When the knock came 20 minutes later, Dawson stood on the porch in full uniform with 2 officers behind him, and Marcus across the street in a charcoal overcoat, watching with the patient sorrow of a man who had arranged the whole thing and was now waiting to feel sad about it. The charge was extortion. The evidence was a thick envelope of cash Dawson produced from beneath the passenger seat of her Malibu, holding it high enough for the neighbors to see, and Naomi stood very still on the porch steps and said that wasn't there. And Dawson said, "Money just grows in old cars." And the officer beside him shifted his weight with the specific discomfort of a man beginning to understand that he is standing on the wrong side of something permanent. Then Caroline Voss stepped off her porch. She crossed her arms over her wool coat and said, in a voice that shook but held, "I saw you put that envelope in her car last night, Brett. I was standing in my kitchen. I saw it through the window." She had stood at that window for an hour afterward, hand on her phone, telling herself it was a misunderstanding, telling herself it was not her place, telling herself all the things she had been telling herself for 3 years on this street. The street went completely silent. Dawson turned toward her slowly. "You want to be careful about what you think you saw, Caroline." And Caroline Voss, who had watched everything from behind closed curtains for 3 days and eaten the shame of it every morning with her coffee, looked at him with the terrible clarity of someone who has finally run out of reasons to be afraid and said, "I have been careful long enough." At the station, they put Naomi in a beige interview room with a bolted table, and Dawson across from her with a paper cup of cold coffee and the full weight of a man who believed the walls were on his side. He offered a deal. She said she wanted a lawyer. He talked anyway, because men like Dawson always talked, and the transmitter sewn into the hem of her sleeve recorded every word. Storage Unit 47 sat at the end of a gravel row off Route 22, between a retired man's golf clubs and a widow's dining set, and it held 3 folding chairs, a box of nursing textbooks, and an old chest freezer pushed against the back wall that hummed with the patience of something waiting to be found. Naomi had read her aunt's letter 3 times on the drive over, the careful handwriting, the unhurried certainty of a woman who had known exactly what she was leaving behind and for whom, and she went straight to the freezer. Behind the ice tray, sealed in a waterproof metal box that she worked open with her right hand alone, was a file binder labeled Cedarwood Heights Access Road, and beside it, wrapped in a cloth, a small digital recorder from 2018. She pressed play. Her aunt's voice did not come first. Marcus Holloway's did, smooth, unhurried, addressed to George Talbot in what sounded like a dining room or a study. People like Elaine Carter don't understand that this community was built to maintain a certain standard. If she won't understand on her own, we help her understand. Then George's voice, quieter. And if she still won't move, then Marcus. Then we make staying more painful than leaving. Naomi stood in the storage unit with the recorder in her unburned hand and let the silence settle around those words. Behind the binder was a second document, handwritten by Elaine in the same careful script as the letter, a list of 11 families. Names, addresses, the year each was pressured to sell, the price they accepted, the price Marcus paid, the price he sold for 8 months later. Every family was black. The pattern was 11 years old. It was not corruption. It was a system. She was still photographing the final page when she heard tires on the gravel outside and recognized, without needing to look, the particular idol of a truck that belonged to a man who had followed her twice already and had not yet understood what that would cost him. The community hall meeting was Marcus's stage, and he had arranged it perfectly, folding chairs in neat rows, an American flag by the podium, butter cookies on a plastic tray near the back wall that no one touched. 40 residents filed in, dressed like it was Sunday service, and Marcus sat at the front table with the comfortable authority of a man who had chaired this room so long he had stopped separating it from himself. When Naomi walked in, he smiled broadly enough for the whole room to hear it, and Dawson, standing against the wall in uniform, muttered something to the officer beside him that made 2 people in the front row look down at their programs. The meeting cracked open in the 3rd minute. Earl Washington stood from the 3rd row and did not sit back down when Dawson told him to, and then Earl said, in the measured voice of a man spending something he had been saving for years, that he had been a detective on this county's force for 19 years before Marcus Holloway's influence had buried his report on Dawson and forced him out, and that he had tried twice to file with the State Oversight Board before both submissions were returned without explanation, and that his wife had gotten sick the year after, and that he had made a calculation a tired man makes when he has run out of institutions to believe in, and that he had been quiet about it since and was done being quiet now. Patricia Elwell stood next and placed 8 years of HOA records on the board table and said she was resigning and would testify, and the sound of the folder hitting the wood was very quiet but very final. Then Naomi read aloud from her aunt's handwriting, one line, just one, and the room went so still that the fluorescent lights above seemed to get louder. They don't want the house. They want our disappearance. Marcus stood and called it fantasy, and Naomi let him finish and then said, quietly, why did you offer to buy my aunt's property 3 times? And looked at George Talbot and asked whether he had written that pressure should come through code enforcement first and hardship line second. And George's face answered before his mouth could refuse to. The meeting did not end cleanly, but it ended with questions Marcus Holloway could not answer in a room that had finally stopped letting him arrange the silence. The meeting ended at 9:43. By 10:15, Earl had called in a false gas leak report to the utility company and was talking to Talbot's private security at the gate of Marcus's property on Hillcrest Drive. Agnes had recorded the passphrase 6 days earlier through a heating vent in the private dining room, the way she had recorded other things over 11 years of being invisible in a room full of powerful men. Naomi entered the property through the eastern maintenance access, reached the server room in the basement, and plugged in at 10:21. The second biometric lock had a 90-second window. Agnes's passphrase opened it with 9 seconds remaining. The transfer completed at 2:14 in the morning. The courthouse was already half filled when Naomi arrived, and Marcus sat in the front row in a charcoal suit with his attorneys, and the practiced grief of a man whose story had always been believed. Dawson stood near the aisle in full uniform. The local prosecutor shuffled papers at the table without looking up. Leonard Hayes entered behind Naomi with 2 federal agents, and the room's temperature changed immediately. The judge asked where Miss Carter had been, and Naomi said, "I am here, Your Honor," and removed her credentials with fingers that still trembled from nerve damage but did not drop them, and said she was Special Agent Naomi Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, 16 months undercover, and the silence that followed had a different quality than any silence she had heard in Cedarwood Heights. It was not the silence of people choosing not to see. It was the silence of people who finally understood what they had been looking at. The server vault transfer had reached the Department of Justice at 2:14 in the morning, every file intact. Jury payments, Dawson's consulting invoices, altered police reports, the access road acquisition strategy, the 11 families, the offshore accounts. Naomi had paid for it with burns on a hand that would never qualify for a service weapon again, and she stood in the courtroom with both hands wrapped in white bandages and held them up when Marcus said she had broken into his home and said, "Your system initiated emergency deletion. I used my own biometrics to stop it. Everything you tried to erase is now federal record." Marcus said, "This is not over." Naomi looked at him with the patience of someone who had spent 16 months inside his certainty. "No, but now everyone can read it." 3 months later, on a cold Tuesday morning, she stood before the front door of a small brick house on Magnolia Grove Court and looked at the new sign beside it, Elaine Carter Community Legal Clinic, free legal counsel for housing rights, and thought about her aunt in her nursing whites, spine straight, eyes forward, 32 years of taxes paid on a house that powerful men had decided should never belong to her. A gun stops one man, Naomi thought. A clinic stops a system. She opened the door and went inside. Drop a like if Naomi's story moved you, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and which moment stayed with you the longest.